sway the hip.
Great. Okay, let's start with Richard Berger's intro to this room. Here.
Woo! Woo!
Oh no,
Maya, you are a gem.
I am. I know.
You
So
crank me up.
thank you very much for appreciating that fact. Right. Okay. So Timothy, once again, good morning to everybody who is watching on LinkedIn and YouTube and Twitter. So we have just started the live stream, but we are going to be on Tuesday's briefing. So thank you very much for being here. To everybody who is listening or watching us, if you are on Clubhouse, you can click on the link to Timothy's profile on LinkedIn at the top of your screen. Or if you are watching on YouTube or LinkedIn, you can probably you can click on the links there. So thank you very much, and Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maya. What a beautiful day. So I'm dialing in from Uraga. It's near Yokosuka. It's just between Yokosuka Bay and the well-known Yokosuka Prison, which is right around the corner. This is a pretty big marina. It's a very ritzy place, which is why I frequently come here. But it's a nice marina. It's a proper marina. I sailed over yesterday, maybe a 4-hour sail across Tokyo Bay. And after this briefing, then I will sail back. The wind is going to be to my back, so I will be able to fly that new Jenniker that Evan and I secured 2 or 3 weeks ago. So with that, let's talk about Japanese politics and what's going on. So a lot of people ask me, hey, Langley, how come you know all this stuff and how come you can do these briefings? I mean, were you trained at Langley? And, that sort of thing. And the response is that I've been doing this for a long time. As you know, I worked in Japanese politics. And since leaving Japanese politics as a secretary to a member of the parliament, going back to the United States, finishing law school, working in companies doing their government relations and their political analysis for large companies and embassies and that sort of thing. I've kept in touch with all of the people that I met while I was working in the parliament and their diet secretaries, many of whom have become members of the parliament themselves. But also I join these study sessions, these benkyokai, that are hosted by just about every member of the parliament as a way to kind of develop their political funds. They usually have a lunch or a dinner. And as they reach something of a critical mass, maybe 10 years in the diet, then they get a little bit more support from their political party to have what they call a hagemaskai, which is a big event. They stand up on the stage, usually with their wife, quietly, and people just step up on stage and they talk about how marvelous they are. These things usually run about 10,000 to 20,000 yen. It's kind of like a $200 plate dinner, but I attend these all the time. I have people on my team that attend them. It's not quite pay to play, but it's like having a master's degree or PhD degree seminar on a rolling basis. But that's one of the key features, and I think most people don't do that because people are just busy doing other things. But this is a part of my business, staying in touch with those influential people within the parliament is a key component of what we do. But there are also 2 other features that help enrich that, and I wanted to just explain that to you before I go into my briefing. The first one is Bunshun. Okay, this is the magazine that you see on the newsstands. We talk about it all the time. It is kind of the counterpart to contemporary news and television, the newspapers. It comes out every Thursday. Um, some people who some people just don't like it. They say it's a rag. It has pictures of girls in the first couple of pages, and then it talks in somewhat scandalous terms. It exposes people, individuals, rich people, executives, but it hones in really hard on the politicians. And it being highlighted in Bunshun can really destroy your relationship. But they do deep digging. It's not as severe or not as accurate as some investigative reporting would dictate, but it's quick and it's hot topical news. um, if you go anywhere in Japan, in the bathhouses, in the restaurants, in some of the places where people just frequent, you'll almost always see Bunshun, or it'll be tucked under the counter. People read it all over the country. It is a very popular counterweight to contemporary news. And keeping abreast of that is always important in giving you kind of a richer picture of what's going on in Japanese politics. The second one is this little book. It's called the Binlan. It comes out every time they change the diet. It's a selection of all of the members in the parliament. It has it's like a name list. It has the photographs of the members of the parliament. It outlines the cabinet, who's sitting where, what their terms of office are, how many votes they won by. So you can pick this up at any bookstore. They're usually there. But if you've ever visited the Diet, and I think probably a lot of people who have attended these briefings has attended, maybe the member's office building somewhere, but they have a bookstore there, and they sell these like hotcakes. But this little document, this booklet, is very helpful in understanding the background and the kind of history of each of the members of the Diet. It is very short, so it's somewhat cryptic, but after you've worked with it, it's a very valuable document to have at your fingertips. Excuse me. So for those of you who are really interested in Japanese politics, if you'd like a copy of that, please message Maya or I, and if you can't get access to it, we'll see if we can arrange getting you a copy of that. Once again, I really appreciate people joining this briefing because it indicates, a growing appreciation and awareness of what's going on in Japanese politics and how that influences and impacts, our everyday lives. And today is no different. The Diet closed yesterday. It was an extraordinary Diet session called by the Prime Minister in response to the Unification Church and the Abe funeral, as you might remember. This was about 3 months ago. So the Prime Minister called an extraordinary Diet session to at least deal with opposition calls. I mean, it was almost riotous. He had to do something. They were insisting on him answering for why in the hell are we having a state funeral for Ms. Abe, and what is this thing about the Unification Church? So he hemmed and he hawed, as is typically his fashion, but he initially launched a extraordinary Diet session. And since they were going to do that and respond to the opposition criticisms and questions about his handling and why he chose a state funeral, he also thought he needed to sweeten that deal, calm things down so that he had bargaining chips on the table to talk about a second supplemental budget and also about what he plans to do with taxes and spending. So they started that Diet session, and it has been really a fight for him. And he's suffered in a couple of ways as a consequence of that. Not only did he have the kind of the win that he had for the upper house election, but he also had almost very quickly the resignation of one of his key Diet cabinet ministers. Since then, in the period of about 1 month, he's had 3 members of his cabinet resign or forced out. One of them was directly related to his affiliation with the Unification Church. One was because he made some maybe inappropriate comments about the death penalty, and it was the Minister of Justice, and how he's really unpopular and not in the news until he signs somebody's death warrant, and that got him into some hot trouble. And then finally, there was another individual who was a little bit loose on his campaign funding, campaign reporting, and the receipts that he submitted for reimbursement. He also is from Hiroshima. He is a member of the Kishida faction. And the fact that he took that hit, it came out just 2 or 3 days later that, lo and behold, the prime minister suffers from the same sort of deficiencies. So there's a lot of controversy and a lot of speculation going back and forth about, this is not something that I should be fired for just because of these inaccuracies in the reporting. You have been guilty of it too, and we're friends. And how did you ask me to resign from the cabinet? Now I'm disgraced. I have to go hide my head for a couple of years before I can reemerge as a prominent politician. And we're in the same faction. So there was a little bit of speculation about that. Since then, it's calmed down a little bit. There is another Diet member who is potentially being examined, being reported by Bunshun, and there are also competitors to Bunshun, other not rags, magazines, weekly magazines, Shincho, for example, who are really digging at this, and they see and they smell blood in the water with the prime minister. So not only with the opposition, but also with members within the LDP, the prime minister has enemies. The LDP is not a unified political party. It's a party made up of 6, perhaps 7 political groupings. Most of them are factions. Mr. Suga, who was prime minister just before Mr. Kishida, has his political grouping. It is speculated to have about 40 members. It is not a formal faction yet, and he's bided his time. But in any event, there are a lot of people that just want the prime minister to do something, to be more vibrant about politics and about decision making, and that's one of his, is the things that he's criticized about. That he doesn't quite make decisions. He doesn't take action. He talks. The new capitalism is an idea that he promoted when he first became prime minister. Actually, he talked about it before he became prime minister. But there are a lot of things that are going on that just rub people wrong. And with the closure of this diet, so one of the things that people were looking at is the closure of the diet was scheduled for yesterday, the 10th. And because of the opposition and clamoring against Mr. Kishida, because of the Unification Church, because of the Abe funeral, which is kind of old news now, there were a lot of people who just wanted to diminish him. And they've been pretty successful at that. There has been no prime minister that has had numbers as low as the prime minister, who has lost 3 cabinet members in 1 month, who has survived. So people are, counting, days on their fingers, wondering when he's going to tumble, and how can they accelerate that. So that's one of the backgrounds that he's been fighting against. So a lot of people speculated that he wasn't going to be able to pass the 60 bills that he predicted that he would be considering in this diet session. They've come nowhere close to passing 60 bills. But they did pass some of the significant ones, the Unification Church and the second supplemental budget. And when you pass the second supplemental budget, it's a lot of money and it's distributed. It's like politics anywhere. There are some bennies for people to get them to vote for this bill. So there's a lot hidden in there. There's a lot packed in there. And I'd like to go into that just a little bit in talking about his, the prime minister's situational dynamics within the LDP. In any event, the diet is finished. The diet won't convene again until sometime in January. We don't know when that is. It's constitutionally mandated that the diet start its session in January. It is for 160 days, so it goes right until early June, late July. I'm sorry, late July, June, or early July. Um, and the prime minister sets when that date starts. So between now and that date, and it could be as late as January 31st, that's a lot of time. That's a lot of play time, especially if you're, sharpening your fingernails and wondering how you're going to diminish the prime minister. He doesn't have a lot of loaded bullets, but the opposition does. So his approval rating is now in the 30s, low 30s, high 20s. They did a poll just this last week. This poll was directed at managers of major corporations. It was pretty well attended, a high response rate, and 63% of those who were questioned, these are corporate types, dislike the prime minister, dislike his handling, dislike what he's been doing with the economy, with the inflation rate. They've got a little bit different bend than the normal polls that go out that are reported once a month on a kind of a rolling basis. I expect we'll have one probably next week. But this particular poll is just focused on business leaders, and they are not happy with him. And that's a big deal because the LDP is, it's big blue. It is the corporate interests that support the foundations of the LDP. So this is a big dynamic that he needs to be careful of. The inflation is beginning to kind of taper off a little bit, so that's something that's going in his favor. There have been some pronouncements by the Bank of Japan and Mr. Kuroda. It looks like there is a second person in the showing, a fellow who was in the finance ministry. Actually, Mr. Kuroda once served with him, who is somewhat of the architect of the 2% inflation target. This was talked about this week by Mr. Kuroda. And this individual, he's now at Columbia University as a professor. Mr. Ito is talking now about the inflation numbers, and he and Kuroda seem to be co-jointly talking on issues such as that. So the thing that's pretty clear is that Mr. Kuroda will be there until April when his term ends. And this individual, Professor Ito, is being touted as his replacement. There's no other official news on that, but when they start making statements like this, you can kind of predict it. And since he was the architect of the 2% inflation rate, it looks like we will stick with that under any new administration. But also predictions and projections from economists are that this is going to be tapering off pretty quickly in 2023. It can't happen quick enough for a lot of people, but it's one of the dynamics that the prime minister needs to deal with. He's also got factional infighting and jockeying that is always attacking his credibility. There are people that want to become prime minister, but in Japanese politics, it's just undiplomatic to actually raise your hand. So he has to deal with those issues too at the same time that he's trying to keep his cabinet together. One of the problems that you have in distributing cabinet seats is you give them based on the power base that these particular factions have. So you're kind of inviting in your competitors into how you run the government. And once they become a cabinet minister, you can't manage everything they do or say. And some of them build their own base. Sometimes they criticize the prime minister for his stance or for his slowness, or they blame him because they can't get things done. And their star rises and the prime minister's diminishes. So there's this careful calculus that goes on. When the prime minister is on the up, you don't want to do something like that. But when he's on the down, it's an easy target, and people clap hands and slap you on the back and say you're doing a great job and you should be prime minister. So we've got a lot of that, and we predict that a lot of that will be happening before the new diet session opens. So let me see. With regard to the prime minister, his numbers are extremely low for any healthy prime minister to survive. He's got to get beyond the high 20s and the low 30s. He passed the supplemental budget. That is supposed to do something. That is a tremendous amount of money. 29 trillion yen in a supplemental budget. This is the second supplemental budget. This amount of money is to be devoted to spending before this year ends. This fiscal year ends in April of 23. So December, January, February, March, April. That amount of money, I mean, some of it is to pay for decisions that were already made, but that's a tremendous amount of money for the second supplemental budget. It is just a number that's really hard to get your head around. If you think about one of the other bills that was passed was the defense budget going from 1% to 2%. And there was a lot of haggling going on there. I think this is going to be another thing that bites him in the butt. When you think about defense spending going from 1% to 2%, I don't think anybody in this briefing can recall a time when that was a public conversation. It just happened. It happened. It was an Abe, a former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, dreamed to expand the budget with regard to defense spending. It is one of the hallmarks of the Seiwakai faction, but Mr. Kishida's faction is much more peace constitution and keeping defense spending down, preserving that. He comes from Hiroshima, so he's very heavy on nuclear non-proliferation. But for some reason, it's very complicated. It went from 1% to 2% without a whole lot of public debate. And now it is becoming policy. He instructed his finance minister and his defense minister to come up with the numbers and the way that to get those numbers maybe a week ago. They came up with the report, and then he instructed the rest of the cabinet, I want to do this with the defense budget. Those numbers are coming out now, and it's going to hurt him because there's no real clean way to pay for this amount of money. But when you talk about the defense spending that's required, they're going to increase taxes by 1 trillion yen each year for the next 5 years. But that's only 1/4 of the money that's actually required to meet that number. And the interesting thing, I'm reflecting back now on the supplemental budget. That supplemental budget is 29 trillion, but the defense budget is 27 trillion for 5 years. I'm sorry, 43 trillion. So 29 trillion for the supplemental budget versus 43 trillion for the defense budget for 5 years. Can you wrap your head around that? 29 trillion for the supplemental budget to be spent between now and April, and a 5-year defense plan consisting of 43 trillion. It's just mind-boggling. The issue that the prime minister has is he hasn't quite figured out how to pay for it. So the past this this is actually not a bill. It's instructions that he's given to his cabinet. And in the new year, from January, they will talk about budget deliberations. So a lot of the discussions that we have on this briefing are about politics and about discussions on bills. Once we move into January, they talk about the budget. So how to pay for this, what gets in, what gets out, how do we distribute it? So the discussion in these briefings will change in January as a consequence of that. But what they've decided is that since the defense budget needs to increase, in order to preserve himself, he has said that we're going to increase the taxes. 1/4 of the 4 trillion that's required every year will come out of taxes, but we're not going to raise the taxes in 2023. So fiscal 2023. So between now and April, nothing's going to happen with the budget because we're still riding on the budget that was passed last year. Once we move into 2023, from April, they will pass a new budget that will probably go into effect in 2024. But what the prime minister has said, he's kind of deftly said, I'm going to pass this, but you don't have to pay for it right now. While I'm prime minister, you don't have to pay for it. So it's a little bit of nice dancing. I think people are going to pick up on that. One of the criticisms that he's had is he doesn't do anything. He talks the big talk, but he doesn't quite do anything. When he makes a statement that the defense spending is going to go from 1% to 2%, and this is how it's going to be paid for, you need to put that to the population. I think he's buying time by telling people you're not going to suffer right now, but maybe when I'm not prime minister, you won't have to suffer. The thing that he's worried about is that he's got precious little time to preserve himself as prime minister, and he really needs to, probably Japan needs him to be as well. He needs to be prime minister in the spring of this year. On January 1st, Japan takes the presidency of the G7, and they host the G7 in May here in Japan. There's a lot of lead up to it. And then in Hiroshima, there will be a big conclave. He will be the host nation. He'll be welcoming all these people. And if he's not prime minister, that looks kind of yucky, doesn't it? If you're prime minister, you sure want that. He's been planning for it. And if in fact there is a change in prime ministers between now and then, and that's a coin cost. In fact, who knows how that's going to shake out. But when he's the host nation, when Japan is the host nation, it's in Hiroshima. It would be great if he was the spokesman and the person to welcome all of the people. The main feature of the G7 this year, they've already been talking about it, is nuclear nonproliferation. He's been talking about that publicly for a while. They had a conclave in in Hiroshima just this last week. He provided a video message, and also former President Obama provided his message too to this conclave of elite people in the nuclear nonproliferation. So they're building this thing up. It is beginning to grow. But to see that Mr. Obama, former President Obama, is also toning in on this, also indicates that you might expect to see him in Hiroshima in the spring as well. But it was somewhat unusual that the former president also pitched in on that. But this is a very big deal for the prime minister, and I think the decisions he makes about paying for the budget and pushing it off is one of those ways to kind of keep the mood down. Don't have people any more angry with him than he already is. So on Thursday and Friday, there was a lot of movement on the defense budget. The defense budget is going to be a big issue. There are two issues that are huge in this current Diet session, the one that ended just the other day. One is Unification Church, and one is the defense spending. There are a lot of other bills. Mr. Hagiura, who is the policy affairs chief within the LDP, said in this Diet session, he said this 3 months ago, we want to pass 60 bills, and there's not 60 bills that were passed into law. Unification Church was, and the supplemental budget was. Those were actually done just this last week. So it was really very active. It's always active, but it was very active in the Honkaigi, the main session of the Diet, where you actually go to vote this last week. So what they decided on defense spending is we're going to go from 1% to 2%. It's not quite 2% for 2023, 2024. It's more like 53%, but we will be ramping it up, hopefully to hit 2% in 2027. Of the amount that's needed, 1/4 of it per year, they predict it's about a trillion yen, which is $7.3 billion per year. That will come out of taxes. There are only 3 ways that they can kind of generate that funding. One is they increase taxes, they do bonds, they sell bonds, they reduce spending in other ways, or they just create money to pay for it. And the prime minister said on Friday bonds are off the table. We're not going to do bonds. We're going to increase taxes. And those taxes are not going to come from an increase in the consumption tax. So he's made that statement. So that's pretty clear that we're paying 10% now in consumption tax. It's not going to go to 12% because of the defense budget. It could go to 12% for other reasons, but as far as defense spending, he said that's going to come out of basically individual and corporate taxes. So the corporates, you know, the 63% who said we don't like the prime minister just a couple minutes ago, are now going to be even angrier because they have to come up with this amount of money, this new amount of money, because it's going to be coming out of corporate taxes. The only other way is tapping surplus money. I don't know where they get surplus money from, but not tax revenue and spending reform. So in staking that claim, the prime minister spoke to the entire Diet. He said, we need to cooperate with each other. We need a unified purpose in describing to the population why we need this. And you can understand that people are listening to this and thinking, yeah, maybe you do, but I don't know if I'm on board with this. And you're the one that made the decision. So there is expected to be some fireworks going on there. Let me see what we've got. That the economy has been hampered by Ukraine and by COVID as a consequence of those. He needs to generate more revenue in addition to this new idea on defense spending. So he's got a couple of things that are going on. The other thing that they're talking about with defense spending is this, I guess it's a somewhat recent concept that has come up about counter-strike capabilities or attacking preemptively an enemy base. This is said in general terms, but clearly what we're talking about is North Korea and their launching of missiles. So the United States, Australia, South Korea, and Japan are really hunkering down on having a defense shield over Japan, which means that Japan needs to purchase many Patriot missiles for defensive purposes and the Aegis system. So I think they've decided maybe 2 or 3 years ago that was necessary, and as a consequence of that, we need to increase the defense spending. So that's one component of it. But these Tomahawk missiles are state of the art from the United States. Japan wants to develop their own and create something of a military industrial complex. They can't do that when the technology that they sell is only for defense capabilities. And the Constitution and the interpretation of the Constitution says that it can't be, for example, dual use. You can't use it offensively and defensively. It needs to be defensive. So you can say submarines are defensive. You can say tanks are defensive, but they're also offensive weapons. So there's a little bit of what would you say, loose interpretation of the words to get to the result that they want. I think eventually what's going to happen is that Japan needs to confront the Constitution, the restrictions on defense, and the ability of Japan to be offensive in capabilities. That's one of the strongest reasons why the United States and Japan are so firmly bonded together, because the United States provides that kind of offensive protection should it come to that, and Japan is supposed to hammer down on the defensive capabilities. And I think the Japanese government has probably rightly decided that it's just not enough to rely on the United States. They got a big scare when President Trump decided that they needed to spend more to pay their fair share. So I think that shook not only Japan, but it shook a lot of countries when that threat came up. So I think they need to bolster that. And I sense that they're going a little bit quicker than the Constitution allows. And at some point in time, it will be held, what they're doing, to be unconstitutional. There'll be several claims that are raised. Typically, it is given a lot of fanfare, but not much is done. It just is a very slow process. But I think this thing with the defense spending and the offensive capabilities is a necessary component of this alliance with the United States and this unity of like-minded countries against China, against North Korea, against Russia. You can see that all across the board. Japan is becoming much more active in diplomacy, in the 2+2 scenario for meeting the defense minister and the foreign minister of several countries, of signing different stipulations and agreements with other countries. Before the year ends, the other thing that the Japanese government must do is produce and finalize 3 defense documents. And those documents will kind of project what Japan is going to do, what their commitments are to the United States and to the region. The National Defense Strategy, the National Security Strategy, and the Medium-Term Defense Program are 3 documents that must be produced before this year ends. It's a 5-year plan. It comes out every 5 years. There was a little bit of a delay because of COVID. So since 2019, 2021, there was little progress, little changes made. So it's a little bit of catching up. So you can understand that the prime minister needs to do things differently than what the other strategy told him to do. But it's interesting when you think of the 5-year plan that we are currently under. That was a 5-year plan for 27 trillion yen. That's about 1% of the GDP per year. And that's going from 27 trillion to 43 trillion. This new 5-year plan will encompass that. So there are a lot of things that will be in that strategy. It will be published. People are eagerly looking forward to it to see what kind of things are going on. We already understand the Tomahawk missiles, the Aegis defense systems. We also learned just recently that they will weave in the Japan Coast Guard into the self-defense forces. So that's a big deal too. That's a lot of resources. It's a blend of 2 cultures that are not very similar. And we'll see how that works probably within days. Today is the 11th, so there's another 20 days left in this month. So there's a lot expected to be happening, although not within the parliament. The Unification Church issue also received approval. That was a tough issue for the prime minister. It provided a lot of barbs for his opposition. The dynamic here is Komeito is also the political arm of Soka Gakkai, which also proselytizes and also generates funds from donations tremendously, actually, and were the model for what the Unification Church was doing. I don't know if the Unification Church was more aggressive in soliciting funds or in promising that there is a spiritual reward for this donation, and if it's a little bit more, then the spiritual reward is a little bit more. That kind of shop talk that goes on. But this has received a lot of attention from the opposition parties as well, and which is why this bill had such difficulty passing through. It did pass through. They are focusing on the fiduciary abuses and actually considering the Unification Church, not as a church, but as a cult. Konotaro, one of the favorite people that we like to talk about, mentioned the other day that this classification as a cult really takes them away from having any kind of tax protection for donations that are received, and it looks like that is going to receive a lot of support. When they pass a bill, they don't get everything right. They go back and retweak it. There are some certain instances that come up, and we can expect that once we get into the new year that there'll be a lot of attacks on that. And similarly, there are a lot of other churches. It's not just the Unification Church. There are a lot of organizations and religious affiliated institutions that are going to suffer from what is being passed down on the Unification Church. So they have to back off a little bit on mentioning the Unification Church specifically, because it's a law, it's supposed to apply to all people. But, you've got very prominent institutions here. You've got Mormons, you've got Scientology, you've got the Catholic Church, you've got hundreds of different Protestant religions. You've got the, who are the people that keep going? they always knock on your door. I forget the name of them from the Midwest. But there are a lot of organizations. What's that?
The Mormons?
No, it's the other one
No.
that come in and.
Okay.
I can't remember it, but they knock on everybody's door and have you found Christ, and can I talk to you? Can we have coffee? The Mormons used to do it that way. I think they've backed off it a little bit. Their strategy is a little bit different than doing it that way. But it's a funny country. Japan is a funny country when you think about religion and the national culture and the national psyche here. So it's something that I think is going to generate a lot of attention. Malicious donations and solicitations. When you think about that, heavy-handed, coercive activities, threats for, if you don't do this, then, your grandfather is going to be unhappy with you, and all of these, spiritual salvation is tied to these donations. So all of these issues, mind control, have been dealt with in this bill. Let's see how it goes. But, Komeito is being very careful here because they don't want to be criticized for the activities that they've been following for the last 40 years. I'm going a little bit long. I apologize. Geopolitics, Hagiura is the policy affairs chief. He's number 3 in the LDP, maybe number 2. He is a very prominent person. He's in the Seiwakai, the former Abe faction. He was in Taiwan this last week for 2 days. A lot of talks on, facilitating discussions between Taiwan and Japan. Also the, TSMC, the semiconductors, having this facilitation there. So there's a lot of activity there. Not only that, the Netherlands just signed an agreement as well for supplementing high tech and chip manufacturing with the United States, and Japan has a piece of that. U.S., Australia, and Japan are discussing now troop rotation. Did you hear that? Troop rotation. So we are going to be rotating troops, Japan, the United States, and Australia. So this month it's Australia's turn to host the United States and Japan, and then next month it's Japan's turn to host the United States and Australia for troop exercises. That's a little bit scary and is an indication of really the sense of the times that we are in now. In these briefings, I cannot convey to you how delicate the geopolitical situation is. And all of these things that are coming up, they are indicators, they're precursors of what is coming up. People know something that we don't know, and we can read in the tea leaves what they're preparing for a lot of eventualities or contingencies. So you need to watch these things because they help you predict what is going on, and when things happen or don't happen, you kind of understand why. So for business people, the hike in corporate taxes is coming. It is going to come with a vengeance. It's not going to be in 2023, but it will come, and finding other ways to supplement the defense budget. If you think about it, excuse me, the amount of taxes generated by tobacco in Japan pays collectively, it doesn't actually go to it, but that amount of money for the taxes of tobacco that's smoked in Japan equals about 1% of the national budget, the gross domestic product. So that amount of funds needs to be regenerated to go from 1% to 2%. So they need an industry, or they need a sponsor, they need some way, some new technology to boost that. And that's one of the reasons I believe this military-industrial complex idea, Japan has been in the doldrums for more than 20 years. They need to get out of that. They don't know how. They've tried a lot of different things. They've tried the 3 arrows, the 4 arrows. They're now thinking about the new capitalism. They've really got to come up with something, because with the population declining and the demands on the budget, the demands for Japan to pay for things, their overseas development assistance is also being criticized as being too weak and not bold enough. And they've had decisions just this last week outside of the diet within the organizations of Japan's ability to make more aggressive donations to this the Asia Pacific region to help these countries, substantiate themselves, airports, ports, infrastructure, that sort of thing that the Japanese are particularly good at. So there's a lot of demands on Japan, and with the G7 coming up and Japan as the host, it really tells Japan, you've got to pony up. So a lot of it is talk, but they actually have to perform too. Belgium, looks like they had a state visit this last week. If you noticed the flags flying, it wasn't the king, but his sister, the princess, came and brought a huge delegation, 600 people from various chambers of commerce and from the ministries there, a huge delegation that came into Japan just this last week. And this new thing with jet fighters. So in the past, Japan has been participating in producing armaments with the United States, some of the wings for the jet fighters and that sort of thing. They've now decided that they're going to go for a new jet fighter, production of a new jet fighter called the Tempest, in conjunction with with the UK and Italy. So that's Japan, UK, and Italy. This is a break from the past where typically it's the United States and Japan. Japan is trying to develop that technology. The United States is doing all of the good stuff. Japan has a certain portion of it, but most of the manufacturing is going to be in the United States, or at least the compilation of the components that go into it. But Japan desperately wants to develop those kinds of technologies. The Constitution prevents it, the dual use prevents it, but having that kind of a military industrial complex generated the space program, it generated Velcro, it generated all of these technologies that the United States benefits from, and United States industry benefited from. And so I think that's one of the drives for Japan. With that, I'd like to close up. I know I didn't touch on everything. I went a little bit long on the political part. Maya, anything else to add there?
Well, for the moment, we are good. I believe that there will be questions on Clubhouse, also on LinkedIn. So we can talk about this after we close the live stream and move to Clubhouse. So thank you very much for this, Timothy.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening in.
Yes, very much. Okay.
So I'll sign off here, and then I'll meet you at the Q&A session in Clubhouse.
Yes.